Martha Bell crushed the last biscuit between her palms and divided it without looking up. She made her piece the smallest, barely 2 bites, and slid the larger portions across to her boys without a word. Eli, 11 years old, stared at his plate. Then he pushed his portion back toward her. "I ain't hungry, Mama." He was lying. She knew it. He knew she knew it. That was the 3rd morning in a row her oldest son had lied to keep her alive. Martha pressed her fist against her mouth and stared at the wall so neither of them would see her eyes. Before we go any further, if this story already moved something in your chest, please take 1 second to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a single chapter. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to know how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Martha Bell and the summer that nearly took everything from her. The summer of 1883 came down on Caldwell Creek, Texas, like the hand of a god who had stopped caring about the people beneath it. It hadn't rained in 6 weeks. The creek that gave the town its name was barely a trickle of brown water between cracked banks. Cattle were dying on the eastern ranches. Cornfields had turned to straw. And in the smallest cabin on the south edge of town, the one with the warped door and the roof that sagged in the middle like a broken spine, Martha Bell was standing at her kitchen table, deciding which of her 2 sons needed the food more. She'd already made the decision. She just couldn't make herself move yet. "Mama." Noah, 6 years old, tugged the hem of her apron. "Is it breakfast time?" "In a minute, baby." "You said that before." "I know I did." Eli hadn't said anything. That was worse. Her oldest had learned somewhere in the past month that the less noise he made about being hungry, the less guilty his mother looked. He sat at the table with his hands folded like a grown man waiting for a church sermon to end, and Martha had to turn her back on both of them just to breathe. There was flour in this tin, maybe enough for 4 biscuits. There were no eggs. There was no lard left. There was a jar of sorghum with about 2 tablespoons of syrup clinging to the bottom. She'd been scraping that jar for 3 days. She made the biscuits dry and thin, and she baked them over the wood stove that made the cabin feel like the inside of a furnace. By the time they were done, her dress was soaked through, and her hands were shaking not from heat, but from the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too hard. It comes from fighting too long with no end in sight. She cut the biscuits. She divided the sorghum. She put the plates in front of her boys. "You ain't eating?" Eli asked. "I had something earlier." He looked at her the way only an 11-year-old who has learned to read his mother's lies can look at a person. Level. Quiet. Too old. "No, you didn't." "Eli." "Mama." He pushed his plate toward the center of the table. "Take some of mine." "You eat your food." "I don't want it." "Eli James Bell, you will eat every bite on that plate or so, help me. I ain't hungry." His voice broke at the end, and he pressed his lips together hard, and Martha saw it, the tremble in his jaw, the way he was fighting to hold his face still. 11 years old, and already ashamed to cry in front of her, because he thought it would make things worse. She sat down. She reached across and put her hand over his. "We're going to be all right," she said. He didn't answer, because they both knew that wasn't the kind of thing you said when it was true. You only said it when the alternative was too dark to speak out loud in front of a 6-year-old. Noah ate both biscuits and half of what Eli quietly surrendered. He didn't know. He was 6. He licked the sorghum off his fingers and announced that breakfast was his favorite, and Martha said, "Yes, baby, mine too," and she didn't eat anything at all. That was a Tuesday. By Thursday, the situation had not improved. Martha had been taking in laundry from the better families in town since her husband Raymond had left. Walked out one February morning, saddled his horse, and rode north without leaving a note or a dollar or a single word of explanation. Some people said he'd gone to find work in Abilene. Some people said he'd found himself a different woman up in Dallas. Martha had stopped guessing after the first year because guessing hurt more than just accepting that he was gone and not coming back. The laundry work kept them fed through winter barely, but the summer heat had broken something in the arrangement. 3 of her regular clients, the banker's wife, the hotel owner's daughter, and the preacher's housekeeper, had all found reasons in the past month to stop sending their washing. The banker's wife said she'd taken on a girl from the new immigrant family. The hotel owner's daughter hadn't given a reason at all, just stopped. The preacher's housekeeper had told Martha, with the particular cruelty of a woman who thinks she's being kind, that folks were saying it wasn't decent for a woman in Martha's situation to be handling men's shirts. Martha had carried that sentence home and turned it over for 2 days before she understood what it meant. What it really meant. It meant the town had decided she was a certain kind of woman. The kind you don't associate with when you want to protect your own reputation. The kind who made people uncomfortable just by existing too heavy, too alone, too obviously struggling, too much of a reminder that life could go wrong in ways you couldn't always control. She'd cried about it exactly once at night after the boys were asleep. Then she'd gotten up and found 2 new clients on the edge of town, the widow Haverford and the old German blacksmith, who didn't care what the banker's wife thought about anything. But the widow Haverford had gone to visit her daughter in San Antonio and wasn't back yet. And the blacksmith had given her a bundle of work on Monday, and the next bundle wouldn't come until the following Monday. And it was Thursday, and the flour tin was almost empty, and her boys needed to eat. She walked to town that morning because she had no choice. She kept her chin up because she had learned in 2 years of being Raymond Bell's abandoned wife that the moment you let your chin drop in Caldwell Creek, you gave the town permission to keep pushing you down. She wore her good dress, the blue calico faded but clean, and she walked the half-mile into town in the July heat, with Noah's hand in hers, and Eli walking half a step behind like a small bodyguard. She was going to ask Mr. Hatch at the general store if she could take a small credit on supplies against the blacksmith's payment next week. She'd done it once before. He'd agreed reluctantly, with the air of a man performing a great charity. She pushed open the door of the general store, and the little bell rang, and Mr. Hatch looked up from behind the counter. He saw her. His expression did something complicated and then settled into the careful blankness of a man who has decided something in advance. Mrs. Bell. Mr. Hatch. She kept her voice steady. I was hoping we might talk about an arrangement for this week, just until Monday. I can't do it. He said it before she'd finished. I talked to my wife about it, and we just can't extend any more credit right now. With the drought and all. I'm sorry. He didn't look sorry. He looked relieved to have the speech over with. Martha stood very still. Noah pressed himself against her leg. Eli behind her didn't make a sound. I understand, she said. Thank you for your time. She turned around and walked back out into the heat. She made it half a block before she heard it. 2 women talking outside the millinery, not bothering to lower their voices when they saw her coming. That's the Bell woman, Raymond's wife. His ex-wife, more like. He left her, didn't he? Can you blame him, Lord? She just let herself go completely. If I let myself go like that, my husband would. Martha walked past them without turning her head. She counted her steps. 1, 2, 3. Noah was asking her something, but she couldn't hear the words, just the sound of his voice. She counted steps until the voices were behind her, and then she kept counting, because if she stopped counting, she would have to feel things she couldn't afford to feel in the middle of the main street of Caldwell Creek on a Thursday morning. Mama. Eli's voice quiet, right behind her. Don't listen to them. I'm not. I know you are. She stopped walking. She turned around and looked at her son, this thin, serious-faced boy, with Raymond's dark eyes and her own stubborn jaw, and she felt something shift in her chest, something that was almost too much to hold. I'm all right, she told him. I know, he said. And he reached out and took her other hand, the one that wasn't holding Noah. The 3 of them stood there in the middle of the dirt road for a moment. Just 3 people holding hands in the July heat, with no money and no food, and no particular reason to believe the afternoon would be any better than the morning. Then Martha squared her shoulders. Come on, she said. Let's go home. They walked back. The half-mile felt longer than it had on the way in. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was high and merciless, and Noah was wilting against her hip, and her dress was damp through, and the inside of the cabin was like stepping into an oven. She settled Noah on his cot with a wet rag on his forehead. She sent Eli to check if there was anything left in the root cellar. She knew there wasn't, but she needed him busy and out of her face for 5 minutes, so she could think. She sat at the kitchen table and she thought. There was the widow Haverford's house. She could go over and see if anyone was keeping an eye on it while she was in San Antonio. Sometimes neighbors left things. Sometimes there was a garden that needed water, and in return, they might have food to spare. She could go to the church. Pastor Wills had a benevolence fund, and she'd never touched it, never come close to asking for it, because there was a particular kind of shame in that which she hadn't been able to cross. She could walk to the southern ranches and ask if anyone needed temporary help, cleaning, cooking anything, and she'd work every hour of the heat for a day's wages and a sack of cornmeal. She was running the numbers on which of these was least humiliating when Eli came back from the cellar. "Mama." "Nothing there, I know." "There's someone at the door." She hadn't heard a knock. She stood up and crossed to the door and opened it. The man on her doorstep was not anyone she recognized. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in a way that made the doorframe look smaller, and he was wearing a dust-colored canvas jacket. Despite the heat, the kind of man who had been outdoors so long that his body had stopped registering temperature the way other people did. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete sometime around his 30th year and hadn't moved much since. He was holding his hat in one hand and a cloth-wrapped bundle in the other. His eyes were a peculiar shade of gray-green, the kind of eyes that looked like they'd seen enough of the world to have stopped being surprised by most of it. He looked at her, not the way the women outside the millinery had looked at her, not with appraisal or judgment or the particular sliding away of a person who doesn't want to be caught staring. He looked at her the way you look at a problem you intend to solve. "You're Mrs. Bell," he said. His voice was low, not unfriendly, just minimal, the voice of a man who didn't use words he didn't need. "I am," Martha said. "And you are." He didn't answer that right away. He held out the cloth bundle. Inside it, she could see the shape of something, bread maybe, or cornmeal wrapped in cloth. And behind him on the path to her door, she now saw what she hadn't noticed when she first opened the door, a large canvas sack sitting in the dirt, and beside it, something that looked like a cured ham wrapped in burlap. "What is this?" she said. "Food," he said. She stared at him. He looked back at her without expression, waiting with the patience of a man used to being questioned and used to waiting for people to reach their own conclusions. "I don't know you," she said. "No, ma'am." "Then why are you on my doorstep with food?" Something moved in his face, not quite a flinch, not quite discomfort. Like the question had a shape he'd expected, but that still landed somewhere it shouldn't have. "I have more than I need," he said. "And it seemed like you might not." Martha Bell had spent 2 years learning exactly what it felt like when a stranger's kindness came with a price attached. She'd learned to read the particular weight of an offer that wasn't really an offer, the way men sometimes framed charity as obligation, the way help sometimes arrived wrapped around expectation. She stood in her doorway, and she read this man for every signal she knew how to read. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't leaning. He wasn't doing anything that suggested he expected to be invited in, or thanked extravagantly, or owed anything at all. He was just standing there with his hat in one hand and a bundle of food in the other, waiting for her to decide. "Mama." Noah appeared at her side, having apparently decided that enough time had passed that he was no longer confined to his cot. He looked up at the stranger with the fearless curiosity of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned to be suspicious of the world. "Did you bring food?" The man looked down at Noah. Something shifted in his face, not softening exactly, but a kind of careful adjustment, like a man walking near something fragile. "I did," he said. "What kind?" "Noah," Martha said. "It's all right." The man crouched down to Noah's level, which seemed to cost him some effort. He moved like someone with an old injury somewhere in the architecture of his knees. "Cornbread, salt pork, some dried beans. There's a ham in that sack, and some flour. And I think there's apple butter in there somewhere, if you like apple butter." Noah's eyes had gone wide. "I like apple butter." he said with the gravity of a man making an important announcement. Good. The man straightened up. He looked at Martha. He held out the bundle. It's just food, ma'am. Nothing else. She looked at the bundle. She looked at his face. She looked at Noah, who was already gravitating toward the canvas sack in the dirt, with the instincts of a child who has learned that food is not guaranteed. She took the bundle. I don't know how to thank you, she said, and she hated that her voice had gone rough at the edges, hated the way her throat was tightening with something she wasn't going to let become tears in front of a stranger. You don't need to, he said. He put his hat back on. He turned to go. Wait. The word came out before she'd decided to say it. Your name. At least tell me your name. He paused. He looked back over his shoulder with those gray-green eyes that had seen enough of the world. Boone, he said. Wyatt Boone. Mr. Boone. She swallowed. Why did you come here? He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, Kids shouldn't suffer because the world forgot about their mother. And he walked away down the path without looking back. Eli appeared at her shoulder. He'd been watching from inside the whole time she realized standing back just far enough to be out of the stranger's sightline, but close enough to step forward if he needed to. Who is that? Eli asked. I don't know, Martha said. Is he coming back? She watched Wyatt Boone's broad-shouldered figure move down the road toward a horse she could see tethered to the fence post at the end of her property. He didn't look back. I don't know that either, she said. But as she turned back into the cabin with the bundle of food in her arms, and Noah already tugging at the knot in the canvas sack, and the smell of salt pork rising up through the cloth wrapping, and her own hands shaking slightly from something that was not quite hunger and not quite relief, but something in between, she thought about the way he'd crouched down to Noah's level. The particular care of it. The way a man who didn't want to be thanked would do that. Who would take the trouble to make a 6-year-old feel like the question he asked mattered? She set the bundle on the table. She untied the sack. Inside she found cornmeal flour dried beans, a paper parcel of coffee, 3 jars of preserved vegetables, tomatoes, green beans okra, a cured ham the size of her forearm, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a clean piece of cloth, a small jar of apple butter. Noah made a sound she hadn't heard from him in a month. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Can we have some now? He asked. The apple butter. Yes, Martha said. Her voice was steady. She was very focused on keeping it steady. Yes, we can have some now. Eli stood beside her as she started putting things away, and after a moment he said very quietly, so Noah wouldn't hear, Mama, are we going to be all right? She stopped with a jar of tomatoes in her hands. She looked at her son. This boy who had given up his food 3 mornings in a row so that she could eat. This child who had learned to swallow his hunger and call it pride on her behalf. She set the jar down and she put both arms around him, which he permitted for about 3 seconds, before he made the small, irritated noise that 11-year-old boys make when they are being hugged against their dignity, and she held on for 1 more second past that. Yeah, she said. We're going to be all right. And for the first time in a very long while as she said it, she almost believed it. Outside at the end of the road, Wyatt Boone untethered his horse. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the animal's neck, not moving. His jaw was set. His eyes were somewhere in the middle distance. Something was working in his face that nobody was around to see. Then he swung up into the saddle, turned the horse north and rode back toward the empty land he called home. He did not tell himself he was coming back. He did not make promises to himself about what this had been or what it would become. He rode north into the heat, and he kept his eyes forward, and he did not think about the way the woman in the doorway had looked at a bundle of food, like it was the first mercy she'd received in years. He didn't think about it, but he remembered it. Every mile of the road home he remembered it. He came back the next morning. Martha heard the horse before she saw him. That particular sound of hooves on dry dirt that stopped just at the edge of her property, not at her door. She was at the wash basin, her hands already raw from the blacksmith's laundry, She'd started at first light, and she went still when she heard it. Noah was still asleep. Eli had gone out back to check on the small patch of garden that had mostly given up against the drought. She dried her hands and went to the door and opened it. Wyatt Boone was standing at the fence line. He wasn't moving toward the house. He was looking at something along the base of the exterior wall, the place where the siding had come away from the frame, and left a gap wide enough that she'd been stuffing it with rags to keep the heat out. He had his hat pushed back slightly on his head, and his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has identified a problem and is deciding how to approach it. He looked up when she opened the door. "Morning," he said. "Mr. Boone." She kept her voice even. "I wasn't expecting you." "No, ma'am." He nodded toward the gap in the siding. "That's been like that long." "A while." "Hot air's coming straight through. Makes your whole cabin 10 degrees hotter than it needs to be." "I'm aware of that." He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I've got tools in my saddlebag," he said. "Take me 20 minutes." Every reasonable instinct Martha had developed over the past 2 years told her to say no. She had learned slowly at significant cost that accepting help from people created obligation, and obligation was a door that swung both ways, and she was not in a position to honor any debt she couldn't see the full shape of in advance. "Mr. Boone," she said carefully, "I appreciate what you did yesterday, truly, but I can't keep accepting things from a man I don't know." "You're not accepting anything," he said. "I'm fixing a wall." "That's a thing I'd need to repay." "No, it isn't." "Why not?" He was quiet for a beat. Then, "Because I'm not doing it for repayment." "Then why are you doing it?" He looked away from her down the road, toward nothing in particular, and something moved in his jaw, like he was choosing words from a limited supply and wanted to get the selection right. "I drove past here 3 weeks ago," he said. "Saw your boys playing outside. The little one fell through a gap in your porch step, and you had to pull him out by the arm." He paused. "I kept writing. I shouldn't have." Martha stared at him. "I don't want your guilt," she said, and she heard the edge in her own voice and didn't soften it. "I've had enough of people doing things for me because I make them feel bad about their own comfort." Wyatt turned back to her. His gray-green eyes were direct and entirely without apology. "That's fair," he said. "But that gap in your wall is still there." She opened her mouth to answer, and Eli appeared from around the side of the house, stopped short when he saw the horse, and looked from Wyatt to Martha with rapid calculation. "He came back," Eli said. Not a question. "Yes," Martha said. Eli looked at Wyatt with the appraising squint of an 11-year-old who had appointed himself the man of the house and took the appointment seriously. "You know how to fix walls?" Eli asked. "I do," Wyatt said. "Our floor's bad too, in the back room. Mama won't let me go in there." "Eli." "It's true. She said it herself. Said the boards were rotted through." Wyatt didn't look at Martha. He looked at Eli. "You want to learn how to fix it?" Eli's chin came up. "Yeah. Then get me a hammer from wherever you keep your tools, and I'll show you." Martha stood in her doorway watching this transaction happen without her permission, and felt something that was equal parts gratitude and fury, and something else she didn't have a name for yet. Some complicated warmth that she immediately distrusted, because warmth got women like her into trouble. "Mr. Boone," she said. "Ma'am, if you teach my son something, I'm feeding you lunch." That's not a request. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The outline of one. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He fixed the wall in 18 minutes. Eli stood beside him the entire time, watching his hands, asking questions in the rapid-fire way of a boy whose curiosity had been underfed, and Wyatt answered every one of them in the same quiet, specific way, not talking down, not performing patience, just answering like the questions were reasonable because they were. Martha watched from inside, pretending to cook, actually watching through the window, like a woman who has not yet decided whether to trust something and knows it. When they came inside, Eli was talking about the wood grain. Something about how to read the direction of it to know where the weakness would be. Wyatt was listening and nodding and offering small corrections in a voice so low Martha could barely hear it. She put food on the table. Cornbread from last night's gift, fried salt pork, black coffee she'd been hoarding. Wyatt took off his hat and sat where she pointed without ceremony, and he ate like a man who is accustomed to eating alone efficiently, without looking up much, without filling silence with talk. Noah woke up midway through the meal, appeared in the doorway with his hair sideways from sleep, took in the situation with sleepy 6-year-old pragmatism, climbed up into his chair and said, "Did you bring apple butter again?" "Noah," Martha said. "It's a fair question," Wyatt said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced without fanfare a second small jar of apple butter, which he set on the table in front of Noah. Noah looked at it, looked at Wyatt, looked at it again. "I like you," he announced. Wyatt looked down at the table. The corner of his mouth moved again. "Good," he said. Martha looked away before she did something embarrassing. He came back the day after that. And the day after that. He didn't announce himself. He didn't knock and wait for permission. He arrived in the early morning and identified what needed fixing and fixed it. And he let Eli work beside him, and he ate whatever Martha put in front of him without comment or complaint. And then he left. Every single time he left before dark. The rotted floorboards in the back room took 2 days. He showed Eli how to test each board before putting weight on it. Press with 1 foot first. Feel for the give, step back if you're not sure. Never commit your whole weight to something until you know it'll hold you, he said. And Eli repeated it back to Martha that night at dinner, like it was a lesson about more than floors. By the end of the first week, Martha had stopped telling herself he wasn't coming back. The town, however, had taken notice. She found out from Mrs. Garrett, the seamstress, who was the most reliable conveyor of information in Caldwell Creek, because she had a shop on the main street and nothing obstructed her view of the road. "Honey," Mrs. Garrett said when Martha came in to pick up a small mending job she'd done for her, "I don't want to be the one to tell you this." "Then don't," Martha said. "People are talking about that Boone man being at your place every morning. He's doing repairs." "I know that, but that's not what they're saying he's doing." Mrs. Garrett had the expression of a woman who finds gossip morally objectionable but physiologically necessary. "Travis Cole was in the saloon last night saying things. Awful things, Martha. About you. About what kind of woman lets a man like Wyatt Boone come around every day." Martha's hands went still on the counter. "Travis Cole," she said. "He owns half the town, Martha. People listen to him even when they know better." "What exactly did he say?" Mrs. Garrett hesitated, which meant it was bad enough that she was editing it. "He said a woman in your position ought to be more careful about the impression she gives, and that Boone must be desperate if he's spending time out at your place." She pressed her lips together. "I told him he was a pig." For what that's worth. Martha walked home with the mended skirt under her arm, and the sound of her own footsteps loud in her ears, and Travis Cole's words sitting in her chest like a hot coal she couldn't dislodge. Wyatt was at her fence line when she got back. He'd brought lumber today, a whole load of it on a flat wagon, more than she'd seen him bring before, and he was already measuring the porch steps. She stopped in front of him. "People are talking," she said. He looked up. "They usually are. About you being here. About me." She held his gaze. Travis Cole specifically. Something happened in Wyatt's face at that name. Brief, hard. Gone quickly like a flame that burns hot and fast. "What did he say?" Wyatt asked. "Nothing worth repeating." "Martha." It was the first time he'd used her first name. She felt it land somewhere in her sternum. What did he say? She told him. All of it the way Mrs. Garrett had told her, including the editorial softening, which she stripped away so he got the unvarnished version. She watched his jaw work as she spoke. She watched his hands go still on the measuring tape. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "Me coming here?" "What bothers me," she said, is that a man like Travis Cole gets to decide what my life looks like to this town just by opening his mouth. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. He looked at her. The question was still sitting in the air between them, patient and direct and impossible to sidestep. No, she said finally. It doesn't bother me. You coming here? She paused. That bothers me too. That it doesn't bother me. His expression did something she hadn't seen from it before. Something that was not quite the outline of a smile. Something quieter than that and harder to dismiss. I'll talk to Cole, he said. Don't! Her voice came out sharp. Don't go picking fights on my behalf, Mr. Boone. I don't need a man to defend my honor like I'm a piece of property someone insulted. I've been handling Travis Cole's opinions about me for 2 years. I know. Then leave it. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he picked up his measuring tape and went back to work on the porch steps without another word. She stood there for the moment, thrown off by the fact that he'd just let her win. No argument, no mansplaining, no trying to convince her she was wrong to want to handle her own battles. He'd just nodded and gone back to work. Raymond, she thought. Raymond would have argued for 20 minutes and then done whatever he wanted anyway and called it protecting her. She went inside and started on lunch and tried very hard not to think about the difference. 3 days later, she got a second piece of information, this one from a source she didn't expect. It was Eli who told her, because Eli had been in town buying nails from the hardware store on an errand Wyatt had sent him on, alone with a coin in his hand and a specific list, the kind of errand that an 11-year-old stands up a little straighter to complete, and while he was there, he'd heard 2 men talking near the door. Mama. Eli's voice when he came home had a careful quality she recognized. The voice of someone carrying news they're not sure how to deliver. I heard something about Mr. Boone. She put down her mending. Tell me. Those men at the store. They were talking about why he doesn't go into town much. Why he lives alone, way out on that ranch. He paused. They said his wife died, and his little girl. Martha went still. When? She said. I don't know. A while back. They said it was a wagon accident. Some man drove his wagon drunk and went right into them on the road. Eli's jaw was tight the way it got when he was trying to keep his face controlled. They said the little girl was 4. The silence in the cabin was very heavy. Eli, Martha said. Did he see you? Did he know you heard? No. He looked at his hands. Mama, is that why he comes here because of Noah? Because Noah's the same age she would have been. She didn't have an answer for that. She sat with the question all evening, turning it over, and when Wyatt arrived the next morning, she looked at him differently than she had before. Not with pity. She didn't think it was pity, but with a kind of recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has lost something foundational and built their whole existence around the space where it used to be. She didn't say anything about it. She put coffee on and called Eli out to help with the porch railing and stood at the window watching her son hold lumber steady, while this man taught him how to drive a nail clean, and she thought, he's not doing this for me. He's not doing it out of guilt. He's doing it because he's a man who has too much capability and nowhere left to aim it, and her boys walked into his sightline at exactly the moment when he needed something to matter again. That didn't make it less. If anything, it made it more. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known standing at her window with her coffee going cold in her hands, was that 40 miles south of Caldwell Creek, in the county seat, a man named Travis Cole was at that very moment sitting across a desk from a land assessor and pointing to a map. And the square on the map that his thick finger was resting on was the 1/4 acre of land on the south edge of town where a widow's cabin sat, with its newly fixed walls and its freshly hammered porch steps, and its 2 sons who had started laughing again for the first time in a year. Travis Cole had decided that Martha Bell's land was exactly where he wanted to put his new freight depot. And Travis Cole had never wanted something in Caldwell Creek that he didn't eventually take. He signed the first paper that afternoon, and he was smiling when he did it. Martha found out about the land papers on a Wednesday from the last person she expected. Sheriff Dane Pruitt had been the law in Caldwell Creek for 11 years. He was not a cruel man. He was something more common and more dangerous than cruel. He was a careful man, the kind who calculated which way trouble was likely to fall before deciding which side of it to stand on. He knocked on her door that morning with his hat already in his hands, which told her the news was bad before he opened his mouth. "Mrs. Bell?" He looked past her shoulder into the cabin like he was hoping the conversation might somehow happen to someone else. "I've got something I need to show you." She looked at the document he handed her. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, because the first 2 times her brain refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. "This says I have 30 days, she said. "Yes, ma'am." "To vacate my property. The county assessor's office says the title was improperly filed when Mr. Bell registered it. There's a dispute about the original claim." "There's no dispute," she said. "Raymond filed that claim 7 years ago. I have the paperwork." "Travis Cole has paperwork too." The sheriff had the decency to look uncomfortable. "His lawyers say the original homestead claim has a technical defect, something about the survey boundary markers." Martha looked up from the document. "Travis Cole has been planning this." Pruitt didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. "Sheriff." Her voice was very steady. She'd found that the more furious she was, the steadier her voice got. It was like all the heat went somewhere internal and left the surface cold. "You know this is wrong. What I know doesn't always match what the law says, Mrs. Bell." "Then what good are you?" He flinched, put his hat back on. "You've got 30 days to contest it if you want. Get yourself a lawyer." "With what money?" He didn't answer that either. He walked back down her porch steps, the ones Wyatt had just finished repairing, and she stood in her doorway holding the document until his horse was out of sight. Then she went inside and sat at her table and stared at the wall. She was still sitting there when Wyatt arrived an hour later. He took one look at her face and stopped in the doorway. "What happened?" She handed him the document without speaking. She watched him read it. She watched the stillness come over him, the particular stillness of a man who has trained himself not to react quickly because he learned somewhere that fast reactions cost you more than slow ones. He read it once. He flipped to the second page. He read that. He set it on the table face down, and he put both hands flat on the surface and he breathed. "Travis Cole," he said. "Yes." "He wants the land. Apparently the south edge of town is where he's decided to put his freight depot. My cabin is on the south edge of town." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know a lawyer in Wichita Falls. Good one. Handled a boundary dispute for me 2 years back. I'll send him a wire today." "Wyatt." She stopped. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and they both noticed it. "I can't ask you to pay for a lawyer." "You didn't ask." "That's not—" "Martha." He looked at her directly. "Let me help. You've already given us more than we can repay. I told you before, I'm not keeping score." "I am." She pressed both hands against the table. "I have to. Because when you stop coming, and you will eventually, you will. I need to know that I can stand on my own. I can't build my life on a foundation that belongs to someone else. I did that once. I won't do it again." Something in his face shifted. Something that recognized what she'd just said, and where it came from, and didn't argue with it. "All right," he said. "Then let me loan you the money. Legal loan. I'll have my lawyer draw up terms. You pay it back whenever you can. On your terms." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she said. "And don't say because kids shouldn't suffer. Give me a real answer." He was quiet. He looked down at his hands on the table. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual. "Because Cole does this," he said. "He finds people who are alone, and he pushes on them until they fall. He did it to the Whitmore family 3 years ago. Took their farm on a technicality. They had nothing left and nowhere to go, and the whole town watched it happen." He looked up. "I watched it happen, and I didn't do anything, because it wasn't my business, and I had my own grief to carry, and it was easier to stay out of it." Something crossed his face, not guilt exactly, but the specific weight of a thing you can't put down. "I'm done staying out of it." Martha held his gaze. The kitchen was very quiet around them. From outside, she could hear Noah talking to himself in the way 6-year-olds do, narrating some game only he could see. "Send the wire," she said. He nodded. He picked up his hat. Then he stopped at the door. "The thing you said," he said, "about building on a foundation that belongs to someone else." He paused. "That's not what this is. Just so you know." He left before she could answer. She sat at the table for a long time after he was gone. Then she got up. Because sitting didn't fix anything, and she had work to do, and Martha Bell had never once in her life solved a problem by sitting. It was Eli who gave her the idea. He'd been asking for 2 weeks if he could use the old iron smoker that sat rusting behind the cabin Raymond's never used because Raymond had bought it with big plans and then lost interest, the way he lost interest in most things that required sustained effort. Martha had been ignoring the smoker for 2 years because looking at it felt like looking at everything Raymond had promised and abandoned. But Eli had gotten a rabbit that week trading work with a neighboring boy, and he wanted to smoke the meat, and he'd been asking in that persistent low-level way he had that wore down resistance without ever quite becoming nagging. "Fine," she told him. "Clean it up and I'll show you how." Her grandmother had been the best cook in 3 counties in her time. Martha had grown up in that kitchen absorbing technique the way a plant absorbs light, not always consciously, not always purposefully, but completely. She knew how to work a smoker the way she knew how to breathe. What she didn't expect was Wyatt's reaction when he arrived the next morning and smelled what was coming off the smoker. He stopped dead in the yard. "What is that?" he said. "Rabbit. And I had some pork left from what you brought." He walked over to the smoker. He stood there. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "My grandmother's recipe," Martha said. "Dry rub. Brown sugar, salt, black pepper, a little cayenne, some other things." "What other things?" "That's not information I give out." He looked at her. She kept her expression neutral. "Mrs. Bell," he said very seriously, "you could sell this. I cook for my family. You could cook for this whole town and charge them double what it's worth and they'd pay it." She almost smiled. She didn't quite let herself. "Don't be foolish." "I'm not." He looked back at the smoker. "I've eaten at every decent establishment between here and Abilene. I have never smelled anything like this." She stood there with her arms crossed and looked at the smoker and thought about 30 days and a legal letter and a lawyer's fees in Wichita Falls, and she thought about what it would mean to have something that was hers. Not laundry taken in for other people's benefit. Not survival. Something she built. It started small. She set up the smoker by the road on a Saturday morning with a rough-cut plank propped against it that said, "Smoked Meat Bell Family Recipe." She had 12 portions ready. She sold them in 2 hours. People stopped their wagons and their horses and their walking, and they ate, and every single one of them had the same expression, that particular involuntary look of someone tasting something better than they expected. She sold out the next Saturday in an hour. The Saturday after that, she had to turn people away. Eli ran transactions. Noah handed out the wrapped portions with an officiousness that made grown men grin. Wyatt built her a proper table for the setup, then a small canopy frame to keep the sun off, and when she told him it was too much, he said, "It's wood and nails," which was technically true and entirely beside the point. The boys were different. She noticed it the way you notice weather changing gradually, then suddenly. Eli laughed more. He stood differently, shoulders back, the perpetual watchful tension around his eyes loosening. Noah had started calling Wyatt by name instead of the man. And then one morning, Martha had been inside. She'd only heard it. He had called him something else entirely. She'd gone still when she heard it. Wyatt hadn't said anything in response, but she'd looked out the window, and he was crouched down eye level with Noah, and his hand was on the boy's shoulder, and something in his face was open in a way she had never seen it before. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did Wyatt. But that evening when he was leaving, he stood at the gate a moment longer than usual, and when he finally turned toward his horse, his steps were slower than normal, like he was moving through something thicker than air. The success of the stand was the thing that brought Travis Cole out of the comfortable distance he'd been operating from. He didn't come himself. He sent 3 of his men on a Thursday evening, 2 that Martha vaguely recognized from around town, and 1 she'd never seen, and they came to the stand while she was packing up for the day and told her she needed a commercial vendor's permit from the county office to operate a food business on public road frontage. "There's no such permit requirement," she said. "There is now," the one she didn't recognize said. He was smiling in the particular way of a man who has been given authority by someone richer than himself and is enjoying the warmth of borrowed power. "When was that requirement established?" "Last month." "And when was I notified?" "You're being notified now." Martha looked at the 3 of them. She looked at Eli, who had gone very still behind her with his hands curled at his sides. "How much is the permit?" she said. $40. She didn't react. She kept her face entirely flat, because she knew that was what they were watching for. The flinch, the crack. The moment when she understood that $40 was more than she made in 2 months of laundry work, and the whole point of this exercise was to close her down without leaving marks. "I'll look into it," she said. "You've got 1 week," the man said. They left. The moment they were gone, Eli grabbed her arm. "Mama, $40. "I know. Where are we going to, Eli?" She looked at him steadily. "Go get Mr. Boone." He ran. Wyatt arrived in 20 minutes, still dusty from whatever work he'd been doing on the ranch, and she told him what had happened and watched his jaw go the way it went when he was containing something he didn't want to let out in front of her boys. "There's no such permit," he said. "I know everyone on that county board." "I know there isn't. He's trying to shut you down before you get established enough that people miss it when you're gone." "I know that too." "Martha, don't." She put her hand up. "Don't tell me what he can and can't do. I know what he can do. I've watched him do it for 2 years to everyone who didn't have the means to fight back." She met his eyes. "Tell me what we're going to do instead." He looked at her for a moment. That look again. The one that had no calculation in it, no agenda. Just a man seeing a woman clearly and deciding she was worth the full truth. "The lawyer's coming from Wichita Falls on Monday," he said. "For the land case. I'll have him look at the permit question too." "That's good." She took a breath. "And I'm going to keep cooking." "Cole won't like that." "No, he won't." She looked toward the road where his men had disappeared. "Good." The fire came on a Friday night. It started in the canopy frame Wyatt had built. They found that out later. Someone had packed dry brush beneath it and set it alight after midnight, and by the time anyone smelled the smoke, the whole stand was burning. The smoker, the table, the supply boxes she'd stored there, the carefully labeled jars of her dry rub she'd been putting together to sell all of it. Eli woke her screaming her name. She came out of sleep already moving, grabbing Noah from his cot, pushing both boys toward the door, and when she got outside and saw the fire, she made a sound she'd never made before in her life. Not a scream, something lower and more animal than that. The sound of a person watching something they built get destroyed by someone who doesn't think they have the right to build things. The street filled up fast. People came out of houses, and from somewhere, a fire bucket line started, but the stand was already gone. It burned fast the way things burn when someone wants them to. The crowd stood watching, and several people had the stunned expressions of genuine shock, and several others had the expressions of people who had known something like this was coming and had not said so. Wyatt arrived at a dead run. He'd seen the glow from the road. She found out later he'd been riding home late from the county seat where he'd gone to meet his lawyer's advance man, and he'd seen the orange light against the sky, and he'd ridden flat out for 20 minutes. He came through the crowd without stopping. He went straight to where the stand was still burning, and she grabbed his arm before he could go closer. "It's gone," she said. "Wyatt, it's gone." He stopped. He looked at the fire. Something was happening in his face that she had never seen there before. Not the careful containment, not the measured quiet, but something cracking through all of that from somewhere underneath. He turned around and looked at the crowd. There were 30, maybe 40 people standing there in the dark. Neighbors, townspeople. People who had eaten her food and smiled at her boys and bought portions from Eli's hand and watched Travis Cole's men come to her stand and not said a word. Wyatt stepped forward. "Which one of you saw something?" he said. Silence. "Which one of you," he said louder, "saw something and didn't say anything to her, to anyone?" His voice had an edge now that Martha had never heard from him. Not rage exactly, but the thing underneath rage, the thing that comes from deeper than anger. "This woman has been standing right here in front of all of you for 2 years, struggling, alone, and every single one of you found reasons not to see it." Still silence. But a different kind now. The kind that has weight in it. "She built something," Wyatt said, "with her own hands, with her boys beside her, and someone destroyed it tonight because they knew that none of you would do a damn thing to stop them." And then, from behind Martha's leg, where he had been pressed against her hip since she'd gotten him outside, came Noah's voice, small and clear and completely serious. "Why does everybody hate my mama?" The words went through the crowd like something physical. She felt it, the collective flinch, the ripple of something uncomfortable moving through all those people who had come outside to watch a fire and had not expected to be asked to answer for anything. An older woman at the front of the crowd, Martha recognized her as Mrs. Calloway. The schoolteacher put both hands over her mouth. Nobody spoke. The fire crackled. The smoke rose. And 30-some people who had watched Martha Bell suffer for 2 years stood in the dark with a 6-year-old's question hanging in the air above all of them, and not a single one of them had an answer they could say out loud. Nobody moved for a long moment after Noah spoke. Then Mrs. Calloway, the schoolteacher, walked forward out of the crowd. She was a compact woman in her 60s who had taught half the people standing there how to read, and she walked the way a woman walks when she has decided something that cannot be undecided. She came straight to Martha, and she took both of Martha's hands in hers, and she said, "I am ashamed of myself." That was all. Not an explanation. Not a list of reasons why she hadn't done more. Just that plain and direct the way you say something when the only honest thing left to say is the hardest thing. Martha looked at her. Her throat was so tight she couldn't speak. "Me too." This from a man named Garrett, the husband of the seamstress, a carpenter by trade who had given Martha exactly no acknowledgement in 2 years of passing her on the road. He was holding his hat against his chest with both hands. "Me too, Mrs. Bell." One by one they said it. Not all of them. Some people in that crowd turned and walked back to their homes without a word, and Martha noted those faces carefully, because she had learned that the people who leave when it costs something are as important to remember as the people who stay. But enough of them stayed. More than she expected. Wyatt stood apart from it watching. The anger in his face hadn't gone anywhere. It had just settled lower, banked down into something that would burn longer and steadier than an open flame. He watched Martha receive this one by one from people who had failed her, and he watched her hold herself straight through every single one of them, and something in his chest did something painful that he didn't try to name. The crowd dispersed eventually. The fire was down to smoking embers. Martha put her boys back to bed. Noah went easily exhausted, already half asleep before she got him back inside. Eli lay down, but didn't close his eyes, and she sat on the edge of his cot in the dark for a few minutes, without saying anything, just being there until she felt the tension go out of his shoulders. Then she went back outside. Wyatt was still there. He was sitting on the porch step she'd told him didn't need to be replaced, and he'd replaced anyway, forearms on his knees, looking at the spot where the stand had been. She sat beside him. The night was still hot the way July nights in Texas always were. No relief, even in the dark, the air thick and pressing. Neither of them spoke for a while. "I'm not done," she said. "I know. I'm going to rebuild it, bigger." "I know that too." She looked at the ash and the scorched ground. "He thought burning it down would break me." People like Cole always think destruction is the last word. Wyatt's voice was quiet, hard. "It never is." She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the ash pile, and she studied his profile for a moment. The set jaw, the line of his mouth, the gray at his temples catching the thin moonlight. This man, who had walked onto her property 4 weeks ago with a bundle of food and changed every single calculation she'd made about how her life was going to go. Wyatt. She waited until he turned to look at her. Thank you for what you said to them tonight. I meant it. I know you did. That's why I'm thanking you. She held his gaze. Nobody has ever done that for me before. Stood up in the middle of a crowd and said out loud that I deserved better than what I got. Her voice stayed steady, but only just. Not once. In my whole life. Something moved across his face. Something that looked like it cost him to receive. That shouldn't be true, he said. No, she agreed. It shouldn't. They sat together on that porch step until well past midnight, not talking much. The silence between them, the comfortable kind that you only reach with people you've stopped performing for. When he finally stood to leave, she didn't stop him, and when he reached the gate, he paused and looked back at her. I'll be here at first light, he said. I figured, she said. He was. And he wasn't alone. Martha came outside at dawn to find Wyatt at the fence line, and beside him, 3 men she recognized as ranch hands from his operation, big, capable-looking men, with the permanent squint of people who work outdoors, and the economical body language of people who know how to work. Behind them, 2 wagons with lumber. She stood on her porch and stared. What is this? She said. Tuesday. Wyatt said like that was an answer. Wyatt. These are my men. They wanted to come. He said it without inflection, like it was simply a fact he was reporting. We'll have the frame up by noon. She opened her mouth and closed it again. Then she nodded once and went inside to start coffee, because it was the most useful thing she could do. And because if she stood there looking at those wagons of lumber for one more second, she was going to embarrass herself completely. By 8 in the morning, there were more people. Mrs. Calloway arrived with her husband and a box of provisions. The blacksmith, old Ernst, who had never been anything but professional with her, but had never been more than that, showed up with his apprentice and a set of iron fittings for the new stand frame, and refused to accept any payment. 2 women from the church came, women she barely knew, and they took over her kitchen and produced enough cornbread for 20 people without being asked. Eli stood in the middle of it all with the expression of a boy whose world is being revised at a speed he can barely track. He'd been the man of the house for so long, carrying that weight in his thin shoulders, giving up his food, lying about being hungry, standing half a step behind her like a small sentinel. And now here were actual men, capable ones, building something on his mother's behalf. And Martha watched him figure out what to do with that. He figured it out by working. He picked up a hammer and got next to Wyatt's ranch hand and started doing what he was shown, and within an hour he was keeping pace, and by noon he had the expression that children get when they discover they're competent at something real. Noah handed out cornbread to everyone and announced their names loudly as he did it, as though he were presiding over a formal occasion. The new stand frame went up in a day. Bigger than the first, sturdier, with a proper roof of oiled canvas and a counter built to working height, so Martha didn't have to bend over the whole time. Wyatt had drawn it out on paper in advance. She realized this wasn't improvised. He'd planned it before he arrived, probably sitting up the night before with a lamp and a pencil after he'd left her porch. The realization hit her somewhere in the solar plexus, and she had to go inside for a few minutes under the pretense of checking on the coffee. Mrs. Calloway found her in the kitchen. "You all right?" the older woman asked. "Fine," Martha said. "Then, I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "Except that people care." She looked down at her hands on the table. "I spent 2 years making myself small enough that needing things wouldn't be embarrassing. I got good at it. And now I don't—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I don't know what to do with all of this." Mrs. Calloway sat down across from her. She folded her hands on the table in the precise way of a woman who has delivered difficult truths to children for 40 years and knows how to make them land without breaking anything. "You do what you've always done," she said. "You keep going. You just let people walk beside you while you do it." She paused. "That's not weakness, Martha. That's just not being alone anymore. Martha looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded. Once. Because if she said anything else, the steadiness she'd been holding on to all morning was going to come apart, and she had work to do. She went back outside. The twist came on Thursday. Wyatt's lawyer, a lean, sharp-eyed man named Aldous Webb, who had arrived from Wichita Falls on Monday and had spent 2 days being methodical and saying very little, came to find Martha at the stand, with a document in his hand and an expression that was carefully controlled, but not quite controlled enough. "Mrs. Bell," he said, "I need you to sit down." "Tell me standing," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. "The original title on your land is clean. I've had 2 other surveyors look at the boundary markers, and there's nothing defective about the claim. The survey Cole's lawyers cited was done by a man named Prentice Adler, who has done survey work for Cole on 4 other properties where the original owners were subsequently displaced." He let that sit for exactly 1 second. All 4 of those surveys had similar defects. All 4 were contested too late. Martha felt the ground under her feet do something strange. He has a surveyor, on retainer, to manufacture defects. "It appears so." Webb's voice was measured. "What that means for your case is that the county assessor's original action against you can be challenged with evidence of pattern conduct. It also means—" He paused. "It may mean that the 4 families who lost their land have grounds to recover it." Martha stared at him. "How many people has he done this to?" "4 that I can document so far. Possibly more." She thought about the Whitmore family, the ones Wyatt had mentioned, the ones he'd watched lose their farm 3 years ago and hadn't helped. She thought about the specific weight she'd seen on his face when he told her that story. "Does Wyatt know?" she said. "Mr. Boone is the one who told me where to look," Webb said quietly. She turned around. Wyatt was 20 feet away at the stand frame working. He wasn't looking at her. But she knew he'd seen Webb come over. He'd been watching from the moment the lawyer crossed the yard. She walked over to him. He looked up from what he was doing. "You knew about the other families," she said. "I suspected. You sent Webb looking for evidence. I sent him looking for the truth. What he found is the truth." He held her gaze. "Cole has been doing this for a long time, to people who didn't have anyone to help them push back." His jaw set hard. "That stops now." "Wyatt." She took a breath. "This is going to make him angry. What Webb found. Cole is going to come back at this harder. Let him. You don't have to fight this battle. It's mine. Martha." He set down his tools. He turned to face her fully, and his voice was low and entirely without performance. "I have 60 acres next to this property that I bought 2 years ago because I didn't know what to do with land that didn't have anyone on it. I have more cattle than I can manage alone and more house than one man needs, and I have spent 3 years being useful to absolutely nobody." He stopped, looked at her. "Let me be useful here, for reasons that are mine. Not out of guilt and not out of pity." She looked at him. The question that had been sitting in the back of her mind for 4 weeks climbed forward, and she heard herself say it before she could make the decision not to. "What are the reasons, Wyatt? If it's not guilt, and it's not pity, what is it?" The air between them went still. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. That he was going to deflect the way he deflected everything that got too close to the interior of whatever he was carrying. Then he said, "You know about Claire and Rosie." He'd never said their names to her before. She'd learned them from Eli secondhand, from 2 strangers talking in a hardware store. Hearing him say them himself was different. It had a different weight entirely. "Yes," she said softly. "After they died, I stopped." He paused, searched for the word. "I stopped being for anything. I just existed, managed the land, kept the cattle alive, got through each day until it was over." His eyes were on the ground between them. "And then I drove past this cabin one afternoon, and I saw your boy fall through a gap in your porch step, and I kept riding." He looked up. I don't know why I came back. I don't have a clean explanation for it. But I came back and your youngest looked at me like I was someone worth talking to, and your oldest asked me more questions in 1 hour than anyone had asked me in 3 years, and you—" He stopped again. "You looked at that bundle of food like the world had asked something of you that you weren't sure you could afford to receive, and I understood that. More than I expected to." His voice had gone rough at the edges. "So the reason I keep coming back, Martha, is that for the first time in 3 years, I feel like a person who matters to other people, and I am not ready to give that up." The stand was half built around them. Noah was chasing a barn cat across the yard. Eli was watching from the corner of his eye with the intense pretend casualness of an 11-year-old who is absolutely listening to every word. Martha looked at Wyatt Boone, and she thought about everything she'd told herself over the past 4 weeks about why it was dangerous to feel warmth toward someone whose presence in her life she couldn't explain. Every careful wall she'd built to keep herself from depending on something she wasn't sure she could keep. Then she thought about what Mrs. Calloway had said. That's just not being alone anymore. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right," he repeated. "You matter," she said simply. "To us. You matter to us. I thought you should hear it said plainly, since you went to the trouble of saying your part plainly." She held his gaze without flinching. "Don't make me say it twice." Something broke open in his face, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly the way ice breaks on a river in spring, the whole surface shifting at once, all that held rigidity becoming something else. He pressed his lips together hard and looked away for a moment, and when he looked back, he was composed again. But the composition was different than it had been. Something had been let out of it. "No, ma'am," he said. His voice was rough. "I won't." That evening, Travis Cole made his last play. He came himself this time. No intermediaries, no hired men, no borrowed authority. He came in a black buggy with his lawyer beside him, and he came to Martha's door just as the sun was going down, and he knocked like a man who expects the door to open immediately, because doors generally opened for Travis Cole. Martha opened it. He was heavier than she remembered. From a distance, a broad, prosperous-looking man with a red face and the particular confidence of someone who has won enough times that he stopped seriously considering the alternative. "Mrs. Bell." He looked past her into the cabin, the way men like him always looked past women like her, to see what was behind them. "I think we should have a conversation about your situation before this gets any more complicated." "My situation is fine," she said. "Your lawyer has been making inquiries that are going to become a problem for both of us." "Only for one of us, Mr. Cole." His expression shifted. "I'm prepared to offer you fair market value for this property. A generous settlement. Enough to start over somewhere. I'm not selling. Mrs. Bell?" His voice dropped to something that was meant to sound reasonable, and sounded instead like the particular register a man uses when he's explaining something to someone he considers stupid. "You're a widow with 2 children and no income to speak of. You don't have the resources to fight this in court, and you know it. I'm offering you a way out that lets you walk away with something instead of nothing. Mr. Cole?" She heard her own voice steady as a fence post. "Your surveyor's name is Prentice Adler. He's done work for you on 5 properties that I know of. 4 families lost their land before me. My lawyer has documentation on every single one of them." She watched the red in his face change shades. "You will hear from my attorney about the original suit by Monday. You will hear from the families you displaced through their attorneys shortly after. And you will hear from Sheriff Pruitt. I expect once he understands the full scope of what's been going on in this county under his watch and decides which side of history he'd like to be recorded on." Cole's jaw had gone rigid. "You think a woman like you can stand up against—" "I don't think it." She met his eyes without blinking. "I'm telling you I already have." He stared at her for a long moment. Behind her she could hear Wyatt's boots on the floor he'd been inside at the table with Webb going over documents, and she knew he'd heard the buggy, and knew who it was, and was standing just inside the doorway, now close enough that Cole could see him past her shoulder. Cole looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked back at him with the flat, utterly patient expression of a man who has already decided how this ends and is simply waiting for the other party to realize it. Travis Cole looked back at Martha. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," she said, and she closed the door in his face. She stood with her back against the closed door and took one long breath. Then she turned around. Wyatt was leaning in the doorway between the kitchen and the front room with his arms crossed, watching her. Eli was at the table. Noah had appeared from somewhere and was standing beside Eli with wide eyes. "Is the mean man gone?" Noah asked. "Yes, baby," Martha said. "Is he coming back?" She looked at Wyatt. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "No," she said. "He's not coming back." And for the first time in longer than she could calculate, longer than the 30 days of that legal notice, longer than 2 years of Raymond's absence, longer than however many years it had been since she'd last felt like her life was a place worth standing in. Martha Bell squared her shoulders in her own kitchen and felt with absolute certainty that she was telling the truth. The letter from Aldous Webb arrived on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after Travis Cole had stood on Martha's porch and told her this wasn't over. Martha read it at the kitchen table, while Eli watched her face, and Noah ate his oatmeal with the focused intensity of a boy who has not yet learned that important things are happening around him. She set the letter down. "Mama," Eli said, "what does it say?" "Cole withdrew the land claim," she said. Her voice came out even, which surprised her because the thing happening in her chest was not even at all. "All of it. The title dispute, the survey contest, everything. His lawyer filed a withdrawal with the county assessor's office 2 days ago." Eli stared at her. "It's over. Our part is." She looked at the letter again. "Webb says the county board is opening an investigation into Prentice Adler's survey practices. The 4 other families, the ones Cole displaced, they have lawyers now too." She folded the letter carefully along its original creases. "It's not over for them, but it started." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed his chair back and stood up and walked to the window, and he stood there with his back to her, and his shoulders doing something she recognized, that particular movement of a boy holding himself together, because he decided a long time ago that he was the man of this house, and men of houses don't come apart at the kitchen table. "Eli," she said. "I'm fine," he said. His voice was thick. "Come here." "Mama," I said. "Eli James Bell, come here." He turned around. His face was composed, but his eyes were bright, and she stood up and crossed the kitchen and put her arms around her son, her thin, serious, too old for his years son, who had given up his food and told her he wasn't hungry, and stood half a step behind her for 2 years, like a small shadow determined to catch her if she fell. And this time he didn't make the irritated noise. He held on. "We're all right," she said. And this time she didn't almost believe it. She believed it completely. She told Wyatt that afternoon. He was at the ranch the first time in 3 weeks he'd spent a full day there rather than at her property, and she rode out on the horse she'd borrowed from Ernst the blacksmith because she needed to tell him in person, and she needed to do it before she talked herself out of making the ride. His ranch was larger than she'd imagined. She'd known in the abstract that he had significant land, but riding toward it was different. The house itself was substantial, not grand, not decorated, built by someone who understood structure and permanence and had no interest in ornamentation. It was the house of a man who built things to last and didn't care whether anyone admired them. He came out of the barn when he heard hoofbeats. He saw her, and he went still for a moment in the way he did when something surprised him, that brief, absolute stillness before he reassembled. "Martha," he said. "Cole withdrew," she said from the horse. "All of it." He stood there. Something moved across his face. Relief, she thought, but underneath the relief something else. Something that looked almost like it hurt. "Good?" he said. She dismounted. She tied the horse to the fence post, and she walked toward him, and she stopped a few feet away. "You talked to him," she said, "before he came to my door." It wasn't a question. She'd been working it out for 3 weeks, fitting pieces together. The timing of Cole's visit, The speed of his withdrawal afterward, the fact that Webb had found those documents almost too easily for a man who had presumably been covering his tracks for years. Wyatt looked at her without expression. "You went to see him," she said. "Before I closed that door in his face and felt very proud of myself. You'd already talked to him." A long pause. "I had a conversation with him, yes." "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where I told him I had copies of every document Webb found, and that if he didn't withdraw every claim against your property, I would make sure the county board, the territorial governor's office, and every newspaper between here and Dallas had a copy by the end of the month." She looked at him. "So when I closed the door in his face—" "He was already leaving," Wyatt said. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "He came to offer you the settlement because his lawyers told him to make one last attempt before the withdrawal. He wasn't going to push." Martha stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "You let me think I did that." "You did do it," he said immediately. "I gave him reason to go. You gave him no room to negotiate. Those aren't the same thing." He held her gaze. "I should have told you. I'm sorry I didn't." She looked at him for a long moment. She was looking for something in his face. The particular shape of a man who keeps things from women because he thinks they can't handle the truth. The familiar condescension dressed up as protection. She didn't find it. What she found was a man who had done something on her behalf and hadn't led with it because he genuinely hadn't thought the credit was the point. "Don't do that again," she said. "Keep things from me." "No, ma'am," he said. "I mean it, Wyatt." "I know you do." He paused. "I know." She nodded once. She untied her horse. Then she stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for the conversation with Cole, even though you should have told me." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Both things can be true." The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "They can." She rode back to her boys. The restaurant opened 8 weeks later. Not the roadside stand, something real. She took the space beside the livery stable on the main road, which the owner rented to her, at a rate that Mrs. Garrett, the seamstress, told her was considerably below market. A fact that she suspected had something to do with a conversation Wyatt had not told her about. And she decided to accept the lower rate without asking questions because some battles weren't worth the energy. She had 4 tables inside and 2 long benches on the porch, and a menu that was 6 items, because 6 items done perfectly was worth more than 20 items done adequately. The kitchen was hers entirely. No help, wanted no partners, no shared decisions about recipes. The dry rub was still a secret. It would always be a secret. Eli ran the front. He was 12 now, taller than he'd been in July, carrying himself differently, not the watchful, tight-shouldered weight of a boy braced for the next problem, but the beginning of something more upright, more certain. He'd been working with Wyatt on the ranch 2 mornings a week, learning things: how to read land, how to judge livestock, how to fix a fence line that would hold in bad weather. He came home from those mornings with grease on his hands and a particular expression of satisfaction that Martha had not known how to give him, because it was the expression of a boy who has been taken seriously by a man he respects. She'd watched it happen, and she'd felt 2 things simultaneously: gratitude so deep it had no bottom, and something that ached alongside it. Because every time Eli came home with that expression, she thought about what it had cost him not to have it sooner. All the years Raymond was supposed to be that person, and wasn't. Noah was 7. He had appointed himself the official greeter of Bell's restaurant, a title he'd invented himself, and taken completely seriously, stationing himself at the door during operating hours, and announcing the arrival of each customer by name with great ceremony, whether or not he knew their name, in which case he made one up. The restaurant was full every day by noon. It was not an overnight phenomenon. The first week was slow. People came the way people come to new things, cautiously hedging their expectations. But the food was what it was, which was extraordinary. And word moved the way word moves in small towns, which is fast and thorough. By the second week, there was a line at the door before she opened. By the third week, she had to start turning people away after the kitchen ran out, which she fixed by expanding her supply arrangements and adding an early morning cook session. Travis Cole's 2 restaurants on the main street did not close, but they were noticeably quieter than they'd been in August. Martha noticed. She said nothing about it, but she noticed. The major twist came on a Wednesday in October from a source she hadn't anticipated. She was closing up. Eli had gone home ahead of her taking Noah, and she was alone in the kitchen doing the end-of-day cleaning when she heard the front door open. She came out of the kitchen to tell whoever it was that they were closed and stopped. A woman she didn't know was standing in the doorway. She was somewhere in her 40s, lean and weathered in the way of someone who has worked outdoors for years, and she had the particular posture of a person who has rehearsed what they're going to say and is now terrified to say it. "Mrs. Bell," the woman said. "Yes." "My name is Clara Whitmore." Martha went still. "Henry Whitmore was my husband," Clara said. "We had the farm on the county road 3 years ago, before Cole took it." Martha set down the cloth she was holding. "Come in," she said. Clara Whitmore sat at one of the 4 tables, and Martha put coffee in front of her and sat across from her and listened. It came out in pieces the way painful things do not, in order circling around the worst parts before landing on them. The farm they'd built over 11 years. The survey dispute that came out of nowhere. The lawyer they couldn't afford. The morning they'd had to load their children into a wagon and drive away from land they'd broken their backs on because the legal machinery had ground them down past the point of fighting. "We heard what your lawyer found," Clara said. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "About Adler, about the other families." She looked up. "Our lawyer Webb, the same man he says we might get it back. The farm." Her voice cracked at the edges. "I came because I needed to say if you hadn't fought, we wouldn't have known there was something to fight for. We thought we were just unlucky. We didn't know it was done to us on purpose." She pressed her lips together hard. 3 years, Mrs. Bell. 3 years we thought it was our fault." Martha reached across the table and put her hand over Clara's. "It wasn't," she said. "None of it was." Clara looked at her. "How did you keep going?" she asked. "When it was happening, how did you not just give up and go away?" Martha thought about it. She thought about the flour tin and the dry biscuits and 3 mornings of lying to her boys. She thought about the women outside the millinery and Mr. Hatch's expression at the general store counter. She thought about the particular quality of darkness that comes not from one large catastrophe, but from a long accumulation of small ones. "I had my boys," she said. "That was enough. Just barely some days, but enough." Clara nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mr. Boone came to see us. After the fire at your stand. Did you know that—" Martha looked at her. "No. He came out to where we were staying. We've been living in a rented room in Meridian, the next county over. Him and that lawyer together. He told us what they'd found and said if we wanted to fight it, he'd put up the legal fees." Clara's voice had gone soft. "He said he should have done it 3 years ago, and he was sorry it took him this long." Martha sat very still. "He never told you?" Clara said. It wasn't a question. "No," Martha said. "He didn't." She drove home that evening with the October dark coming down early, and the air finally cooling towards something bearable, and she sat on her porch for a long time before she went inside to her boys. She sat there thinking about a man who kept doing things quietly and not mentioning them, who had apparently been making amends to people he felt he'd failed for months now, who carried guilt like it was something he'd earned the right to keep, and was working off one silent act at a time. She thought about what he'd said to her that afternoon at the stand. "For the first time in 3 years, I feel like a person who matters to other people." She understood sitting on that porch in the October dark that she had been thinking about this the wrong way. She'd been thinking about what Wyatt gave to them, the food, the repairs, the lumber, the legal fees, all of it, and what it might mean or cost or require. She hadn't been thinking about what it gave him, what he'd said it gave him. What she now understood hearing Clara Whitmore's voice, that it had actually been giving him all along. She'd been saving him the whole time she thought he was saving her. And he'd known it. And he'd never said so because he didn't say things he didn't think were his to say. She went inside and she put her boys to bed, and the next morning when Wyatt arrived, she didn't let him get through the gate before she said it. Clara Whitmore came to the restaurant yesterday. He stopped at the gate. He had his hat in his hand. He looked at her with the careful expression of a man who knows what's coming and is deciding whether to step toward it or sideways. "She told me about Meridian," Martha said. "About you and Webb going out there." "Ah," he said. "Wyatt?" "I know." "How many?" she said. "How many of those families did you go see?" He was quiet for a moment. "All 4, he said. She looked at him standing at her gate in the October morning with his hat in his hand and the particular quality of stillness that was his alone. The stillness of a man who has learned to hold himself very carefully because he broke once and the memory of it never entirely left him. "Get inside," she said. "I have coffee on." He came through the gate. They sat at the kitchen table and she poured, and he wrapped his hands around the cup the way he always did, both hands like a man who has learned to take warmth where it's available, and neither of them said anything for a full minute. "I need to ask you something," she said. "All right. What happens next? Not with the case or the restaurant or any of that." She looked at him across the table. "With this. With you coming here every morning. With my sons looking at you the way they look at you." She kept her voice level and her gaze direct. "I need to know what you're thinking, Wyatt, because I can't afford not to know." He looked at her for a long time, his jaw moved once setting. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that this cabin is the first place I've been in 3 years that felt like somewhere a person was supposed to be." He paused. "I'm thinking that your boys are the reason I remember what it's like to have something to show up for." He set the coffee cup down. "And I'm thinking that somewhere between fixing that wall and going to Wichita Falls and everything in between, I stopped being a man who was just getting through his days." He looked at her directly, those gray-green eyes without deflection. "I'm thinking I'd like to stay. If you'll have me. Not as the man who comes to fix things, as something that takes a lot longer to say, and that I'd rather say right than say fast." The kitchen was very quiet. From outside came the sound of Eli calling something to Noah, the two of them already in the yard. The ordinary music of her ordinary morning and the life she had built from nothing, with her own 2 hands and her grandmother's recipes, and a stubbornness that the town had called a character flaw for years, and that had turned out to be the most valuable thing she owned. "Say it right then," Martha said. "I've got time." He did. It took him a while because he meant every word, and men who mean every word don't rush the ones that matter. He talked about the 60 acres next to her property. He talked about a future that looked like something instead of just looking like days going past. He talked about Eli and Noah with a steadiness in his voice that told her what those boys meant to him more accurately than any speech could have. And at the end, he said quietly, "I know I come with things I'm still carrying. I'm not asking you to carry them for me. I'm asking if you'd be willing to walk beside someone who is." Martha Bell had been alone for 2 years. She had fed her children on dry biscuits and pride and a ferocious refusal to disappear. She had been called lazy and broken and hopeless by people who had never once tried to understand what she was carrying or how far she'd had to walk to still be standing. She knew exactly who she was. She had learned it the hard way, which was the only way the knowledge stayed. She looked at Wyatt Boone across her kitchen table, and she made her decision, the way she made all her decisions, not fast, not carelessly, but with the full weight of everything she knew and everything she was willing to become. "The 60 acres, she said. "Is there water on it?" He blinked. Then the corner of his mouth moved. "Creek runs along the eastern edge." "Good." She picked up her coffee cup. "I'm going to need a larger kitchen." Eli appeared in the doorway. At that exact moment, took one look at the two of them, looked at Wyatt's face, looked at his mother's face, and said with the dignity of a 12-year-old who has understood something important, "About time." and went back outside before either of them could respond. From the yard, Noah's voice. "Eli, what's about time?" "Nothing," Eli said. "Go catch that cat." Martha laughed. It came out loud and real and full, the laugh of a woman who has earned the right to it, and across the table Wyatt Boone listened to that laugh and looked like a man who has found after a very long time without it the thing he'd stopped believing he deserved. 1 year later, the sign above the door read, "Bells," and underneath, in smaller letters, that Eli had painted himself on a Sunday afternoon, East. 1884. Customers came from 3 counties. The dry rub was still a secret. It would always be a secret. Noah greeted every single one of them at the door with the seriousness of a boy who takes his responsibilities to heart, and Eli worked the kitchen with the focused competence of a young man who has been taught well and knows it. And on the wall beside the door, in a frame that Wyatt had built from the same oak he'd used to fix the rotted floorboards in the back room of a small cabin on the south edge of town, hung the original deed to the Bell property. Clean, unchallenged, belonging entirely and irrevocably to the woman who had refused to let it be taken. Martha Bell had not become smaller to survive. She had not apologized for needing things, or for wanting more than what the world initially offered her, or for being exactly who she was, in a body that was exactly what it was. She had not been rescued. She had been accompanied through the worst of it, and into something better by people who chose to show up, and she had been strong enough to let them. And Wyatt Boone, who had ridden through 3 years of grief and silence and guilt and empty land, had finally come home. Not to a place. To people. That was the only kind of home that ever actually held.